Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 12 stories, from allegedly true stories involving the paranormal, to tales of experiments and more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. These videos do take me quite a bit of time to create, so if you're feeling generous, and if you feel this video is worth one, please be sure to drop a like rating. It helps the channel more than most think. Subscribing if you're new is, of course, also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Now, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have done things that you can't remember doing. Like not remembering the drive to work early in the morning because you were so tired. Like not remembering where you put your cup of coffee because you were distracted by something else. Right? We all have. But have you ever lost time? And I don't mean while you were sleeping. Lost actual time while you were fully awake. You know, 1 minute it's 2 o'clock and the next minute it's 2:45. Well, I have. It was a cold January night about 8 years ago. Now, I live in a small town. My parents live in the same small town. My God, I sound like that John Cougar Mellencamp song. Anyway, what I should have said was, my parents and I both live in a small town in Delaware. There, that's better. Anyway, I don't remember how this all came about. All I remember is that my wife and I were driving down the road in the middle of a snowstorm. Snow and ice covering the road. Now, my parents live on an old back road known as White Cross Road out in Amish country. That's not the real name of the road, it's just what town folks call it because it's lined with little white crosses on both sides of the road, in people's yards, marking where dogs, cats, and sadly, a few Amish people have been hit and killed by passing cars going much faster than they should have been. Anyway, for some reason I can't remember, my wife and I were driving to my parents' house. I had just made the comment to my wife that it was hard to see the road, but if we stay between the crosses we should be fine. That's when I attempted to veer right, following the road, and felt the van go into a slide. I tried correcting the slide with no response. It was pure ice. Now, I don't care how big of a truck you have, how good your tires are, or if you have 4x4. It doesn't matter. We are all equal on ice. Anyway, right before I started the turn, I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It read 7:34 p.m. The van slid across the road toward a drainage ditch, and one of those white crosses. I remember it was a big wooden cross, about 4 feet high, painted white with the words Maggie on it. "Hold on, we're going in," I yelled and put my right arm out to hopefully keep my wife from slamming into the dashboard. I heard a dog bark and a bright light flash, just as we were going to hit the cross, then into the ditch. That's when it happened. Everything went black. After what I thought was only a few seconds, my body jolted back hard. My eyes opened. My wife was sitting next to me, in the van, both uninjured. Now here's the weird part. The van was back on the right side of the road, fully intact, sitting still with my foot on the brake before the turn. Did you hear what I said? The van was before the turn that it just slid through. How is that even possible? It happened. I know it did. Anyway, I looked at the clock on the dashboard once again. It read 8:13 p.m. My wife and I both lost 39 minutes of time and have no idea what happened in those 39 minutes. "Are you okay?" I asked my wife, confused. "Yeah, you?" she said, equally confused. I think so. I replied. I then took my foot off the brake, hit the gas, veered right again, and drove to my parents' house, unable to get what happened out of my mind. As I said before, I can't remember exactly why we went over there, but neither of us mentioned to them what happened on the way over and still haven't. The ride home was quiet. My wife and I didn't speak to each other, and didn't for about an hour. Finally, as my wife was getting ready for bed, I asked her, Hun, what happened out there? She just looked at me with this petrified look on her face and said, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. Climbed into bed and went to sleep. I respected her wishes and never brought it up to her again. However, I was not frightened. I was intrigued. Although I may never find out what happened in those 39 minutes, I had this weird feeling it had something to do with the Maggie cross. So the next day after work, the roads had been plowed and salted by then, and were pretty much clear. I decided to go back to the turn by my parents' house. I pulled into the driveway of the house that the big white cross stood in front of. I got out of the van, walked over to the cross, and stood there staring at it. After a few moments, I heard a soft female voice say, "Can I help you?" I turned to my right to see this pretty blonde lady standing by the fence that surrounded the house that I was parked at. I introduced myself and explained to her what had happened, half expecting her to look at me like I was crazy, and threaten to call the cops if I didn't leave. But she didn't. She smiled. I was even more confused. "You heard Maggie, didn't you?" she asked. I just looked at her funny. "You heard a dog bark right before it happened, right?" she asked, smiling. "Yeah," I replied. "That was Maggie. Or I believe it to be Maggie. You're not the first to come here and stare at this cross," she said, putting her hand on the top of it. "I'm not?" I said. "No, just last month I had a young man come by and say he'd been texting on his phone while driving. Took his eyes off the road and drifted right off the road. He heard a dog bark, looked up, and swerved the car back on the road to avoid hitting the cross." She answered and tapped the top again. "In the last 5 years, since Maggie's been gone, many Amish kids have left flowers at this cross. I don't know why, but they only leave them at this one." "Who's Maggie?" I asked. She smiled again as her eyes teared up. She said, "Maggie was our dog. She was a beautiful black lab, loved kids, especially our son James. He's 7 now. He was 2 when it happened. One summer's day in June, Maggie, my son, and myself were playing in the yard before we put this fence up. I had got a call on my cell, answered the phone, and took my eyes off James. Mere seconds later, Maggie was barking, which caught my attention. I looked up to see Maggie running across the yard, and James mere feet away from the road. Maggie got in front of him, standing in the road, and nudged him back in the yard. Suddenly, this white car came around the corner fast, hit Maggie, and killed her instantly. She died right there. She died, saving my son. Now, I don't know about that time lost thing, or your vehicle being moved. That's something new, but I firmly believe it was Maggie that saved you that night." "Wow," I said. "Thank you." "You're welcome. My husband will be home soon. I gotta get dinner started." She replied, waved, turned around, and walked back into the house. I got in the van and drove home and never told any of this to my wife. A few months later, my wife informed me that we were having a baby. It was a girl and said that I could pick her name. I decided to call her Maggie. Out of all my earliest memories, the one that I remember the most clearly is of a strange experience that happened to me when I was 8 years old. I do have a lot of memories of times even before that event, but they're all overshadowed by that one night. It's something that I don't share often, except for a couple of times around campfires. I am not really superstitious, and I often explain it as a figment of my imagination or a terrible nightmare, but every time we're sharing ghost stories, I have to tell M. I can't tell for sure, but I think I was around 8 years old when it happened. I had just discovered reading, and books became my primary hobby for the better part of a couple years. Well, I don't really read much these days. Back then, turning pages was what I was doing for most of my waking hours. I read from breakfast to bed, and against my mother's wishes, even under my covers, I would sneak stories to read. My parents had caught me countless times doing so, but with time I developed a flawless plan. At 8 p.m., I was expected to go to the bathroom, brush my teeth, and go to sleep. 30 minutes later, my parents would go into the living room and watch TV, which is when I would sneak out of my room, make my way through the hallway, and tiptoe into the kitchen, where I would carefully borrow a pocket flashlight from the junk drawer. Usually I would read until my parents went to their room, around 10:30, before sneaking back into the kitchen to put the flashlight back into the drawer. Although, after that night, I stopped doing that. I had my nose pressed into a book I borrowed from the library, hiding under my blankets while a small flashlight illuminated the words I was devouring. I don't recall exactly what I was reading, although I remember being drawn to stories about fantastic worlds, or ones that pitted a child detective against an intriguing mystery. Now, that night wasn't like any other night because my parents weren't in the house. They had left only to return in the small hours of the morning, which meant I could read longer. It must have been about midnight when I felt it. Well, in reality, the feeling started hours ago, only it was at midnight when I finally acknowledged it. It wasn't much of a feeling, just a slight impression that I was able to brush away easily. An afterthought, but one that was peculiarly awful. There was someone in the hallway. It's not that I heard anything, like a door or footsteps, but I felt it. For hours I had this impression, this chilling thought that someone was in my hallway. I was convinced that if I was to open my bedroom door, I could find someone standing there. It started as a thought, but the more pages I turned, the more it worried me. Were my parents back? I didn't hear their car pulling into the driveway, nor did I hear the front door creaking open, but someone was in the hallway definitely. I was sure of it. It had been standing there for hours now, and I could tell even without a sound. Nowadays, I would associate that feeling with the sentiment of being watched, but the issue is that I was alone in the house. At the time, I only thought it could be my mother, and I was worried that if I peeked my curious head out of my door, she would know that I was reading past my bedtime again. I then deduced my parents were home, and somehow I must have heard them come in the house. I was afraid they could see the glow of the flashlight from under the door, so I turned it off. I waited under my blankets for a bit longer, hoping the feeling would wear off. It didn't. I couldn't tell the exact reason that pushed me into doing it, but something between curiosity and concern convinced me to take a look. I was ready to be caught by my mother and be berated. I was determined. I decided to leave my flashlight behind, and I walked slowly to my door as to not make a sound. It's in a similar way that I opened my door in the slightest just so I could slip a glance into the corridor. The house was pitch black if not for the frail glow of the moonlight coming from the kitchen window. If there was someone there, it would be hard to tell, but I could still see it. I'm not sure I saw a silhouette, but the outside light reflected on something. Eyes. A pair of eyes. And from there I could make out a face. A head. I assumed a body came with it, but all I could make out clearly were two eyes, fixed to the back of the hallway, staring. The person was completely static. Had it been there all this time? Why wouldn't it move? I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing. It was not my mom. Without shutting the door, I ran to my bed and jumped into my blankets, hiding under my covers, trembling. I was shutting my eyes as hard as I could, clenching at my blankets in absolute terror. I had no idea what it was that I saw, but my blankets were the only place I felt safe. Now, I didn't hear anything after that. No footstep or creaking of any doors. I didn't hear a single noise, but somehow I could still feel it. Strongly as I knew someone was in the hallway, I knew it finally moved. I knew it walked into my bedroom and it approached my bed. I knew it was next to me, slouched over my shaking body, its head glaring down at me. I didn't want to move. I was afraid my leg would brush against its body, or that motion would alert it to take me or hurt me. I could feel its head inches away from me. I couldn't sleep. I must have spent hours immobile, trembling in my bed, too scared to fall asleep. But I did eventually. The next morning, my mother woke me up for school and discovered in shock a book and a flashlight in my bed, and I was grounded again. She took the torch away and hid it somewhere I wouldn't find it. Little did she know, I would never read past my bedtime again. This peculiar event was the sole reason I was terrified of the hallway as a child. I don't think I told my parents what happened, but since then, I would always make sure my bedroom door was closed when I went to sleep. I would never go into the hallway when it was dark, and I would always sleep under my blankets, my back facing the door. To this day, not sure about what I saw. I'm a skeptic at heart, and I do not believe in the paranormal or anything in the likes. Still, I often think about it and I try to find a way to explain it. I think it might have been a case of sleep paralysis or something similar. Maybe it was just a nightmare. But I'm almost certain that this wasn't a dream. I can't remember how the house was decorated at that age, and maybe what I saw at the end of the hallway was a picture frame. That would explain the face, and the moonlight would have reflected from the glass. That would almost put my mind at ease, if not for one little thing. If it was just a picture, why did the light only reflect on the eyes? Hi, my name is Noah. I'm currently a junior in high school, and I'm on our school baseball team. This story is about what happened to me last June while our team was heading to Idaho for a tournament. I won't go into much detail about me or the school I go to, but I think I need to explain at least one thing. My high school doesn't really have a team. It's more like a team sponsored by the school. We play more often in tournaments rather than in our actual league. I live in California, and we were driving to Idaho to play in a tournament. We were going to drive through Nevada in order to get to Boise and sleep in a hotel to play the next morning. I remember it was a hot summer night, sometime in the middle of June. Most kids on the bus were asleep, but 5 or 6 of us were still awake. I was one of those kids. I found the long ride and continuous orange streetlights to be very relaxing and peaceful, but I still couldn't fall asleep. Eventually, we left the empty desert highway area and made our way into a small sleepy town along the highway. The bus driver exited off the highway and we began to drive into the town. There were a lot of rundown buildings, dimly lit streetlights, but overall it seemed like a nice little place. Our coach sat up off of his seat at the front of the bus. Alright, we're going to stop at a gas station so you can go to the bathroom or get snacks, and then we'll meet back here and finish the drive to the hotel. This will be our last stop, so if you need anything, get it now. Told us. I opened my phone and saw the time illuminated on the screen. 10:32 p.m. We took a sharp turn around the corner and pulled into the gas station parking lot. It was a little dark aside from the lights inside the gas station and the one orange lamppost. It was complete darkness. I heard the wheels screech a bit and heard the compressing of the brakes as the bus came to a stop. The doors opened and about half of us got up. Some kids chose to just stay on the bus and just wait till we got to the hotel. I decided to get up just to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. I grabbed a white hoodie from my backpack and put it on over my shirt to block the cold. I also grabbed a $10 bill from the front zipper of my bag. A line of kids shuffled out the door into the parking lot. As I stepped out the door, I was immediately met with the light vapor and chill that came with the foggy night. You could see the fog in the distance as it shrouded the lights down the road. I stood in the parking lot and stretched my arms up, looking around the area as I did so. I noticed there was nothing behind the gas station but an empty dark desert that stretched on for miles and miles. Lots of crimson red sand and dark green shrubs out in that never-ending landscape. I walked through the clear glass, swinging double doors of the gas station, and held it open for the kid behind me. I could hear the buzz of the halogen lights as I perused about the aisles, searching for a snack to grab. I picked out one of those rolls of Oreos from the shelf and walked it over to the wall of drinks. I opened the cold refrigerated door and grabbed a Sprite from the row of sodas. I slowly made my way over to the counter, looking at the aisles as I did so. I got to the counter and put down the candy and drink I had chosen. "That'll be $4.50, the cashier said to me in a slightly raspy voice. I pulled out the $10 bill from my pocket and slid it across the counter to her. While she was ringing it up, I was looking around the store for a bathroom sign, but I didn't see one. She set the items back on the counter along with a $5 bill and 2 quarters. "Is there a bathroom here?" I asked her. "The door's outside, right wall. Should be unlocked," she answered. "Thanks." I responded as I grabbed all my stuff from the counter and headed out the door. I looked down the long street and the fog blurring the dim orange street lights that were perfectly parallel to each other on either side of the street. There were some small portions of chain-linked fences, paint decaying on the buildings, and overall just an unnerving beauty in this small strange town. I stopped my gaze down the street and started walking around the right side of the building. There it was. A metal door with chipping green paint on the outside of it. I knocked on the door just to make sure it was empty. When there was no response, I turned the knob and pulled open the door. It was just your typical roadside gas station bathroom. Not much else than a toilet, a sink, and some paper towels. The light above me was surprisingly bright, a flickering light every now and then. I don't know what it was, but something just made me feel uneasy. There was a second door in the bathroom that I assumed led into the gas station because it was right on the wall leading into the building. I pulled the handle just to make sure it was locked and it shook, but it didn't open. I went to the bathroom as quickly as I could because at this point, I just wanted to get out of there. I started washing my hands at the sink. I had my earbuds in, listening to music, but in the distance, I could hear this strange clicking sound. I took out one of my earbuds and I definitely kept hearing it, as if it was getting louder. I completely yanked out my earbuds, switched off the faucet, and turned towards the door. It was still there. I can only describe it as a strange repeating, clicking noise. I was hesitant to do anything, but assuming it was just one of my teammates, I called out, "Hey." It stopped, dead in its tracks. The noise went completely silent. All I could hear was the buzzing halogen light above me. I slowly put my ear up to the rusty, heavy door to listen for anything outside the bathroom. But there was nothing. No sound. Just silence. I moved my ear from the door and went to turn the handle, but as soon as I did, I heard this low screaming, growling sound. I covered my ears and fell back onto the tile floor. The screaming continued in a very low pitch. It actually sounded more like crazed growling, like a rabid dog desperate to get inside the bathroom. The door started shaking. The handle started turning, but the lock was holding it shut. As the growling rose, the door shook more and more violently, like it was going to tear off its hinges. Whatever was outside was going to stop at nothing to get inside. For a moment I was frozen, on my hands and knees on the tile floor, but as the growling and screaming continued, I went to the only thing I could think of. In retrospect, I should have just called one of my teammates, but my mind didn't go there. I went to the other door, the one leading into the gas station. The handle was shaking like crazy and the metal hinges were starting to move and rattle as if they were going to burst. I knew that the door wasn't going to hold much longer, so I started pounding on the second door, pleading and yelling for help. I pulled on the handle and tried desperately to break the lock, almost in unison with whatever was trying to get into the bathroom. The growling rose again, louder and louder. It felt as if my ears were bleeding, and to my horror, one of the 3 hinges on the door broke and clattered onto the floor. The door started to bend and move, more than it was before. My breathing was rapid and my heart was beating like a race car. As I continued to desperately try to get into the gas station, I could see the screws on the second hinge start to loosen. As soon as the second hinge broke and fell to the ground, the door into the gas station opened. I fell onto my knees and hands into the gas station, behind the counter, where the door opened up. But when the cashier opened the door, an amazing thing happened. The screaming stopped, and the door stopped moving. For a second, I thought I was just crazy, but when I looked into the cashier's eyes, I could see she was just as terrified as me. She gave me a slight nod as if to signal that she heard it too. I very slowly rose to my feet, but I was so shaky and jittery that I almost fell back down. I looked around the gas station to see all my teammates staring at me. Thankfully, they had all heard it and seen it, so everybody had witnessed the same thing as me, and no one questioned my sanity. According to one of my friends, some of the adults ran out to look at what was making the noise, but by the time they got there, it was gone. We stayed at the planned hotel that night, but ultimately we decided not to play in the tournament that weekend. We headed back to California that morning, and I didn't fall asleep at all for the following 2 weeks. I was terrified of being alone for the next few months and had to see a psychiatrist. But as of now, I'm doing okay. Better, at least. I quit the team after that season for unrelated reasons, but I still hang out with a lot of my old teammates. Every so often, someone will bring up what happened that night, and we'll talk about it for a while, but nobody knows what happened, or saw what was making that noise. But honestly, I'm fine not knowing what it was, and I'd rather not learn. Like most children, Christmas was my favorite time of the year. The lights, the decoration, the snow-covered streets, and the chiming bells of the carolers. But the most exciting part, the presents under the tree on Christmas morning. However, there was one thing that I always didn't look for when Christmas time was getting near. It is a very particular tradition that is often shrouded from the excitement of the holiday, and it's forgotten. That is until when its time comes. In Bulgaria, most people are quite superstitious and have small rituals that are often seen in a household and in their daily lives. For example, never celebrate your day prior to your actual date, or it's the same as if you were celebrating your death, or tying a red string around your wrist to ward yourself against malevolent eyes and gazes. However, the most frightening to me as a child, and to this day, is the Dinner of the Dead. At least, that's how we call it. There is no doubt that in Bulgaria, Christmas Eve is probably the most important tradition. I dare say even more important than Christmas itself. Of course, to me as a child, it's the opposite, but the more I grew older, the more I realized why that was the case. Most families value tradition and the gathering of its members, so it's no surprise that a holiday solely based on such values to be always looked forward to. Most people see this as an opportunity, for once in our busy lives, to find time to spend with the whole family, to cherish it as some people might have no one, to forgive and forget old grudges, and for once appreciate the life we have and the people who are still around us, and a drink for those who are not. A day of warmth amidst the barren and lifeless winter, and the busy and noisy life. When Christmas Eve rolls around, the table is always outstanding, as if my parents would pour their hearts and souls for every single dish. there would be a plate filled with cabbage rolls, a meat of various kinds from pork chops, sausages, grilled meatballs, various yogurt-based and vegetable salads, would be scattered amongst the table, and with every plate being decorated with silver cutlery and themed napkins. We would sit and indulge in our feast, while the television would often play some random music channel. The whole event was always beautiful and heartwarming. It was such a day that the most suppressed and embarrassing moments would surface, causing laughter, joy, and oftentimes a cleansing sensation of the soul as you are parted with long-time memories that were stored in your mind. It is at such faithful day that I came across my own long repressed memories and let them emerge at the surface. The most important part of the day, however, is the so-called Dinner of the Dead. After our mortal vessels are done feasting and joyfully sharing our moments of being alive, we were to leave the table and its contents, including all food, as it is. The table was not to be cleaned until the morning. The idea behind such ritual was that, during this time of the year, where the veil between the living and the dead is at its finest, we would leave food for our past loved ones so they could enjoy and share our meal. It is often done as a way to give rest to the spirits that will come at night, and also for once in their eternal life to feel welcomed and cherished. When I was about 12 years old, when my parents had finally disclosed to me this bizarre ritual, for me it was always sort of an excuse from my parents' part for not cleaning the table because they felt lazy. That night was one of the scariest nights in my entire life, as of course the thoughts of ghosts having a midnight supper in our living room, quite the irony I suppose, was terrifying. It took me hours to fall asleep as the imagination of a 12-year-old does not mix well with the emotion of fear and dread. My mind was conjuring all sorts of things that night. I remember imagining white figures emitting a faint blue light and being tangled in heavy chains while their rugged clothes floated in the air. Such images in accord to the howling wind of outside, sounding as wails were making every moment dreadful. For once, every sound in my house at night felt unnatural and wicked. If there was a slight movement of a door, I would immediately freeze from fear, as the thought of an icy cold hand grasped it and tried to push it aside. Nonetheless, my young mind could not stay for long awake. Eventually, the sands of the Sandman had come to effect, causing me to close my eyes. As my mind was embracing the slumber, the white ghouls and their rusty chains were quickly swiped underneath the rug of wild and vivid child dreams and imaginations. The next day, the thrill of presents and toys immediately had made me forget about the past night's dreams and terror. With the years, I grew over this initially bizarre tradition that is until when I was 17. It was summer when I learned of my grandfather's passing. He was taken by a stroke while working on his garden. Since we live abroad, we learned the ill news by phone. Death itself is a devastating news for one to bear, but I always thought that such matters, when disclosed by a phone or a text, are often more crushing. Nonetheless, my mother was devastated, and rightfully so. She knew deep that this time was near, but learning it and knowing she could not even attend to his funeral was even more crushing for her. Me, on the other hand, I felt shocked and I cried, but it came to pass rather quickly. Now you might say I'm heartless, but the reality is, I never really saw the old man, apart from 2 times when we went to visit in Bulgaria in the summer. What really never came to pass, however, was the constant feeling of guilt in not having enough time to spend with him. The 2 times I saw him were the most beautiful to me. They were the closest thing I ever had when it came to having a grandparent, and for those 2 moments I am grateful. And when winter came rolling around that year, these feelings grew stronger. It was Christmas Eve and the time was approaching midnight. Will, my sister and I were the only ones left at the table. We chatted and talked for a while, but at the same time, I felt an eerie sensation, one that I haven't felt for years. The burning log in the fireplace and the decent amount of consumed alcohol didn't seem to warm any part of my body. I felt a sudden breeze surrounding me, causing my hair to rise and to send a shiver down to my spine. I stood up and yawned while suggesting to go to sleep. An excuse, of course, for me to get away from this non-living room. I remember taking a glimpse back before closing the light switch. The once alive table, adorned with beautiful food and festive materials, was now dead and forgotten. Pieces of bone, once surrounded by meat, was now nothing but a pale white claw, piling over one another in a chaotic mess. It was cold that night. The winter wind howled once more outside, causing the rusty hinges of the windshields to shriek. As I prepared myself for bed, I could not shake the feeling of eeriness, creeping with shadowy hands around my chest. It was the very same feeling of dread and fear as they began to slowly come to my mind, draining it from its rationality. The very same feeling when I was 12 and I had finally learned for the first time about this grim dinner of the dead. And just like that, I remember exiting my room and walking in the empty and dark corridor towards the once living room. My footsteps, along with the cold and howling wind, echoed in the hollow corridor, making each step ever so slightly more dreadful. As I approached the door leading to the room, my heart began pounding and I shivered. Not from cold, but from fear. With my hand at half-away distance of the door handle, I stood there frozen when my gaze met the gap between the door and the floor. The emitting light from the fireplace was visible, but what made it truly terrifying was the occasional shadows that covered it, as if someone was passing by the door. For a moment, breathing became obsolete as fear took over, but when I was near my limits, by instinct took over, causing me to swallow and take in a deep inhale. The air was dry and felt heavy. My throat felt sore and I wanted to simply leave, but my mind was determined. Part of me wanted to see what lurked on the other side of the door. I took a step closer. My hand was met with the cold door handle. Before pulling it down to open up for a moment, I took my time to recognize the new sounds around me. You see, when you stay for a long time in silence, you begin to pick more sounds that previously were hidden between the chaotic and louder ones. For a moment, amidst the howling wind and the shrieking hinges, I heard the sound of clinging glasses and faint scraping sounds of cutlery on a plate. Faint voices like whispers were barely carried among the wind, coming from behind the door. I felt for a brief moment a sensation of adrenaline building inside me, and it was that brief moment I took to my advantage to open hastily the door as if I was going to catch someone. But to my surprise, there was no one to catch. The table and its contents faintly illuminated by the startled fire. The dancing lights of the Christmas tree reflected on the misty terrace glass door. I felt relieved, but somewhat disappointed. I don't know what or who I expected that moment, but surely it wasn't the empty and dead table. I strolled around the table, as if I was looking for someone hidden while constantly feeling watched. As I approached the table, I took a glass and poured myself some rakia, which is an alcoholic spirit that is consumed by most Balkan countries. And it was probably the best spirit I could have met tonight. As I drank, I stood and stared outside the smudged, moistured glass doors. There was a sensation of warmth around me. It could have been the fireplace or the alcohol, but it didn't feel like it was that. As I gazed outside, my eyes focused on the reflection of the living room on the glass door. And there is where I saw everything. There were people gathered on the once empty seats, smiling and laughing while the table was filled with all sorts of goodies and bright food. The reflection was bright and warm, and amidst those new faces I spotted one I knew well. My grandfather stood tall next to a seated man dressed in a World War I uniform. My grandfather gazed at me and pointed towards me while speaking to his friends. They looked at me and smiled as if they were talking about something I could not hear. As tears began to form, I quickly turned around to see that it was real. The whole room was lit with bright colors, the fireplace was roaring, and the table was covered with the very same food I ate that day, but around it there were people I had never seen before in my entire life. There were women dressed in old clothes dating back to the 19th century. Men with top hats and curled mustaches, holding their drink in one hand while the other was gesturing as they talked. The sounds of plates and cutlery, along with the chatter of people, felt as if I was suddenly transported to some form of a party. As I stared baffled at the ongoing festivities around me, I heard a faint, soft voice coming from behind me. A voice similar in my head, but could not be placed exactly. Kaloyan, hello there, my boy. Are you enjoying the feast? My granddad stood behind me, proud and firm. His usual dark olive vest was still over his white linen shirt, and a smile was carved on his bright face. Oh, how you've grown. Shame that life had to split us apart so fast. I didn't understand. I couldn't. My mind was racing as it tried to keep up with the current situation, but my heart and soul had different intentions. I remember hugging him, and for once in the past few hours of constant dread, fear, and cold, I felt warmth and love. I broke down. I cried on his shoulder, and vague words exited my mouth as if they tried to form some sort of meaningful phrase, but it was impossible. A burning sensation as if I wanted to scream. My feelings were building up, and eventually, I did. I told him how torn I felt, how that I feel constantly angry for not coming to visit him more, how I could have saved money to get a ticket perhaps to go there. I spoke how angry I was with myself that I took the past 2 visits and his life for granted, my guilt for not feeling much sadness when I learned he died, but as if everything was fine instead and I just bottled my emotions. But the old man didn't say a word. He just hugged me even more, and his soft voice penetrated my sobbing. There, my grandson. Don't shed more tears. We are all meant to die one day, and you could not have known at the time the meaning of time and death. You were a young child back then, Koloyan. You were living the life as a young man should. Be grateful for a meeting, for this won't be the last. We will meet again. Not soon. You will be much older, and I will be here waiting. We will be here always for you. I felt a smile being forged on my face as his words echoed in my restless mind. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve, clearing my vision from my tears, and to my astonishment my grandfather stood there still. We then sat down and talked about various topics, my school, my dreams of what I wanted to do. He had shared his wild stories about my mother and her sister and how they were young and what wild adventures they had put him through. But then his next phrase hit me. With a sigh and a bit of sadness in his tone, he spoke firmly. I'm afraid this is all the time we had, Kolayan. For it's time to head back. What do you mean, Grandpa? Are you leaving? I said with a sincere sadness in my voice. He took a sip from his glass and he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. No, Kaloyan. I will always be here. It is you who is leaving. We shall meet again, but this is not your time. And with these words, my vision had become dark and blurry. The sounds of the once cheerful guests swirled like a vortex in my head, and were getting more and more faint and suddenly replaced with a cacophony of sounds and alarming voices. There were repeated phrases that were ringing in my head. Are you okay? Wake up. Kaloyan, this is not funny. Call an ambulance. And etc. When I opened my eyes, there was a bright light illuminating at me. Around me, I could vaguely see silhouettes that were beginning to look a bit more familiar. I heard their signs of relief in their voices and phrases, how they praised God about me awakening. I saw my father with his hands on my chest, causing pressure to build up inside me. The shocked faces of my mother and sister towering above me were slowly taking form. Christmas Eve has a strange way of bringing people together, and even more strange ways to bring forth the emotions and memories of one's past. To this day, I still feel dread when the time comes around, but not as much since I now know that when my time comes, I will see my grandfather again, and everyone else that I never had the chance to meet. I came to realize why this day is one of the most loved by most people in my country. It is a day where all our hidden secrets will come and emerge on the surface. A day of no judgment and no hatred. A day when the family comes together for one last time. Having our only daughter when both my wife and I were close to 40 years old has its advantages, like being financially stable, where we could just take her to the Florida Keys for her 6th grade Easter break. We actually flew down to Miami and stayed the nights at one of the 1940s Art Deco hotels. The Clevelander, which was located right by the ocean, and unfortunately also right by the spring breakers posing as college students. I regret having my young daughter exposed to the synthetic marijuana smoke, and whatever else those people were exhaling. My wife and I did our best trying to entertain our daughter, but between the effects she was experiencing from the chemicals she had inhaled, and the fact that she had to hang out with her parents who were close to 60 years old, we could tell that she was miserable, and we were failing her as parents. We hoped the car ride to Florida Keys would brighten up all of our spirits tomorrow, so we went to bed in Miami with high hopes. We all got up the next morning, and the one good thing that the chemicals we all involuntarily inhaled the previous day was make us all lightheaded and sleep more than we normally would. We were still able to get on the famous Route 1, heading south to Key West by 8 a.m., and we even got some complimentary coffee and danishes from the Clevelander, which quickened our departure. The drive through the Florida Keys was a bit disappointing, and did nothing more than slip my daughter deeper into her misery and depression. Listening to the Kokomo song for years about Key Largo, I was expecting some type of grandeur paradise, but in reality, Key Largo was no better than the Jersey Shore or Ocean City, Maryland. We drove through key after key, where there was very little scenery to show our daughter, Grace, besides abandoned railroad bridges that were damaged by hurricanes. But let's face it, what does a 6th grader care about abandoned railroad tracks? After going through 30-something keys separated by mostly short bridges spanning what seemed like nothing more than 50 feet, and one long bridge that was 7 miles long, we finally got to Key West. I hate to admit this, but being around rich people and wannabe rich people suits me so much better than being around spring break college wannabes who would constantly smoke whatever substance they could get their hands on and exhale that around my daughter. Key West had a nice charm to it, with a nice mix of homes that were built around the turn of the 19th century, but once again, my daughter Grace could care less about that or Ernest Hemingway's home, or even Fort Zachary Taylor, because what she was really longing for was having a friend that she could hang out with and have fun, and not have to be entertained by her mom and dad who were boring and embarrassing to her. This was our last day staying at the South End Motel, and my daughter was so depressed that my wife was starting to get depressed as well. I told Grace that if she could beat me in a lap of swimming at the local public beach, then I would give her a $200 prize. The beach was 2 blocks from our motel, and it was located right by the most southernmost point in the United States where a monument was located. The $200 was a begrudgingly enough tease for Grace to come with us to the beach. We stopped off first to get a picture by the monument. Luckily, there was a young girl there around Grace's age who was willing to take a picture of the 3 of us, so we could show off to our friends on Facebook that we stood on the southernmost point of the United States. The girl was really friendly and outgoing, and even asked Grace if she wanted to go to the beach with her. Grace was so happy that her and the girl named Nellie jogged to the beach, which was only a few yards away. Both my wife and I felt like our wishes were truly answered, and we just happened to be at the right place at the right time with Nellie taking our picture. For the rest of the day, my wife and I did nothing more than just smile as Grace and Nellie played with each other, as if they had been best friends their whole lives. They both got to the beach at 11 a.m., and besides me buying them both a hot dog at 2:30 p.m., They did nothing more than chase each other around in the water and gathered seashells up until now, which is 7:30 p.m. I haven't seen Nellie's parents and we were starving, so I wasn't quite sure what to do about dinner. It was going to get dark in a few minutes and Nellie said she lived locally in Key West, just a few blocks from our motel. She asked if she could use my phone, that way she could call her parents and we could walk her home. This was really strange to my wife and I, but anything that kept Grace happy was a risk we were willing to take. So the four of us walked over to Passover Lane and Angela Street, where Nellie and Grace walked behind my wife and I. The two of them had a better chemistry than my wife and I did, and we have been married for 30 years. Thank goodness for my phone's flashlight because it got so dark really quick, and we could barely see anything. Nellie was fine regardless with finding her way home, and she was adamant that we didn't come to the front of her house. We respected her wishes, not knowing the exact reason, but assuming that she didn't want us to know exactly where she lived for her and her family's safety. It was so sweet to watch Grace and Nellie hug each other before Nellie walked away. The three of us walked back to our motel room, and even though Grace was upset that Nellie had to go home, she seemed to be in a much better state of mind. We went back to our motel and crashed for the night. My wife and I, for the first time, didn't feel like complete losers, and we didn't regret having a kid later in life, because we watched our daughter interact all day with Nellie in the most happiest ways. From being in the sun all day, the three of us had no trouble falling asleep and were up and ready by 9 a.m. the next morning, where we had about an hour to spare before we needed to go to the airport to catch our flight. Grace suggested that we go see if Nellie was outside by her house. My wife and I thought, well, why not? Because the worst thing Nellie could do is just tell us to go away. So I put Passover Lane and Angela Street back into my phone's GPS, and after packing the rental car with our suitcases, we headed back over to where we dropped Nellie off, which was less than a mile away. My daughter's eyes were glued to the car's window, searching if she could see Nellie. Then I noticed something that I couldn't see last night as I pulled closer to the intersection of Passover Lane and Angela Street. It was something that was really shocking and caused me to stop the car, where my wife and I just looked at each other, because where we dropped that girl off last night was actually a cemetery and not a house. There was even a long tourist trolley bus, but it was stopped in front of the cemetery as a tourist attraction. The odd thing was that I recalled the cemetery being on the top 20 things to see in Key West, but I didn't realize where the cemetery was located. Since we had close to an hour to spare, I parked the car and we followed the tourist off the trolley and into the cemetery. My daughter kept saying, "Dad, this can't be the same place we were last night." But my wife had accidentally dropped the spare motel key in the street as she was fumbling with her phone last night, and the key card was still in the same location as last night. I lied to my daughter and said, "You're right, honey, but I just want to check out the cemetery because it was one of the must-see listed in Key West." Grace looked upset but went into the cemetery. I was curious to hear what the tour guide had to say, but we didn't pay for the trolley tour, so we purposely stayed back to make it look like we weren't trying to steal a free show. The first grave the tour guide showed was a husband and wife murder-suicide, then followed by a set of graves where young men were killed in a dynamite explosion. As the trolley tour guide got to the third grave, the three of us looked at the bronze sculpture perched on top of a rectangular marble slab about 5 feet long by 2 feet across. The three of us might have, well, been on Mars, as we all stood there speechless, looking stunned at an exact replica of Nellie, who we saw all day yesterday. The tour guide started to read the backstory to the sculpture and said, "This young girl Helen, or Nellie, Delaney, who tragically died in 1927 when she was rescuing some of the local children from a fire that was set to the one-room schoolhouse. Unfortunately, all evidence pointed to the fire being a deliberate act, and poor Nellie died 2 weeks later of smoke inhalation, but not before saving the lives of at least 7 younger children." The three of us did nothing more than just stare at the statue for an hour and a half without even uttering a word to each other. We all just had multiple emotions and thoughts going through our heads, and words would do nothing but complicate the issue more. Even when we left, we all kind of just felt we spent enough time looking at the statue and in solidarity. All three of our minds didn't know how to process what happened yesterday, so we just gave up and left the cemetery together. Luckily, the Key West airport was about the size of a Burger King, and there was no hassle going through security, and we still made our flight on time. The flight home, we sat 3 across in the same row, where Grace sat in the middle. My wife and I had no spiritual knowledge to share with Grace, since we've been telling her since she was born that we were staunch atheists, so whatever thoughts Grace had on Nellie, my wife and I just listened. We don't know the long-term effects that one-day encounter with that mysterious girl will have on Grace, but it seems like after we got back from Key West, Grace has been gifted an extra sense that she didn't have prior to the trip. It just seems like she could sense bad, ominous things before they even happen, or sometimes even small, trivial things like the other day when she told me to take a different way to work, when I had to drive to New York because there was an accident by Newark. The only thing was that she predicted that a half hour before the accident actually happened. Unfortunately, there were no photos taken or a phone call made by Nellie, which I assume was because she had no idea how to use a smartphone, which made sense after the fact as she awkwardly handed my phone, not really knowing what to do. Apartment living can be either a blessing or a curse. I am a single male in my 30s, recently out of a relationship. I was on a time crunch due to the fact that the lease on my old spacious apartment was about to be up and I had yet to find a new place. I wasn't really concerned with the area or the price due to the fact that I make a decent living. Being a typical lazy guy, I dreaded going on tours of empty apartments and having to cold call complexes. I went on a website and did a search. The first apartment on the listing was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath for under $850. I sent an email expressing my interest. No less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The voice on the phone told me the requirements, and in less than 10 minutes I had agreed to stop by to see the apartment. I ended up moving in a few weeks later. I wasn't much to write home about. Pretty basic unit. Smelled like paint and bug spray. I lit a scented candle and made my way to the bedroom to unpack. As I was hanging my art on the wall, I noticed some strange patches on the drywall. Some of these were small, about 3 inches, round. The biggest was the fist-sized patch on the walk-in closet. The thing that got me questioning the safety of the apartment was the door frame had been replaced, as if it had been kicked in. I took pictures to show the landlord as proof of pre-existing damage. After a while, the smell of paint started to get to me. I walked into the kitchen to move the candle in order to spread the fragrance throughout the apartment. The candle on the counter was out. I found this to be odd since it was not near a window. I lit it again and returned to the bedroom with said candle. I froze as I entered the room. The box I had been unpacking was on its side and the contents were all over the place. I have a very active imagination and tend to overreact. Taking a minute to pause the music from my phone, I came to the conclusion that the box was unstable and didn't hear it fall due to the headphones. I shook the thought from my mind and continued my unpacking. The following weeks were pretty quiet. I would go to work early, come home late, watch TV, and go to bed. I had a friend and his service dog over for a few drinks. His dog usually sits at his feet and stays pretty quiet. Not this night. It kept pacing between the living room and the hallway, growling as it neared the room. My friend said this was unusual and that he had to leave. That night I woke up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. On my way back, I walked past the walk-in closet and out of the corner of my eye I saw him. He was a young male in boxer briefs. He had his back to me, bent over a duffel bag in the closet. I could hear him talking to himself and listening as if he was conversing with another person. I slammed the door to the walk-in closet and asked Siri to call 911 as I ran out of the apartment. The first unit arrived with lights and sirens. The officers made contact with me and asked if the suspect was still in the apartment and if he was armed. I told the officers that I wasn't sure. Then they proceeded into the apartment with their guns drawn. I heard them announce themselves as they conducted their search. After a few minutes, they came out, weapons holstered. The first officer said that no one was in there and asked me how much I had to drink since he noticed the beer cans from the previous night in the kitchen trash. I told him that I had consumed a few, but I wasn't even buzzed. He mumbled to himself and said his partner would take down a few details for the police report. His partner asked me the basics. He looked back at his partner, whom was back inside the cruiser with the door shut. Turning off his body cam, he asked me what I knew about the unit I was renting and how long was my lease. I told him the length of my lease and that I didn't know much about the history of this place. He sighed and told me that 6 months ago, the police had responded to reports of an armed tenant. The neighbors had called in about his strange actions and threats. When the police arrived, he had barricaded himself in the bedroom and was armed. They attempted to talk him down, but he began firing out the window. They had no choice but to kick in the door to the bedroom and put him down. I watched the officer in silence as he finished his tale. Before turning on his body cam, he asked me if I was religious. I responded that I was Catholic. He nodded and recommended that I get a priest to bless the apartment and to get some sage. I thanked him and he walked back to the cruiser. In the morning, I will be contacting the local parish and going to purchase some sage. In the meantime, I'll be napping in my car. That day started like any other. I rolled out of bed half asleep, threw together some toast and jam to eat on my ride to work, and hopped in my car. The drive was uneventful, as usual. Road crammed with cars, billboards screaming in my face to pick up this or that, or watch this or look at her. By the time I got to the clinic, I was more tired than I had been when I first woke up. "Morning, Linda. I picked you up a coffee. It's on your desk." That was our receptionist, Anna. She'd been with us for years, and some days her smile was the only one I'd get. We didn't have the friendliest patience. "You're a godsend." I smiled wearily and trudged around the corner to my office. I powered up my laptop and scrolled through my emails. Prescription refill requests, complaints about new treatment regimens, and scheduling questions. As I sipped my coffee, I slowly began to formulate my responses. So all that was typical. Unfortunately, the day didn't go on that way. Around 9, our patients started to arrive. I greeted each with a smile, as usual, and received mostly grunts in response. "How are you today, Mr. Landry?" "Mrs. Senna, great to see you again." "Allie, how's your daughter?" Each one I dutifully led to the scale, into a treatment room, obtained their blood pressure and temperature, and sat them down in our lovely flower-printed vinyl chairs to be punctured by me. I spent a lot of time taking blood. Landry, Senna, Allie, and more patiently sat while I affixed a tourniquet to their upper arms. I guided their arms below their hearts and asked them to clench and unclench their fists, feeling the anticubitals as they swelled up. I massaged them and let the blood engorge the fat veins as the crooks of their arms. Then, after cleaning the site with an alcohol swab, I quickly swooped in with a butterfly needle. All it took was a quick jab, and blood began to flow down the needle into my collection tubes, filling them with thick, red, vicious blood. This was my favorite part of the job, if you can believe it. Nothing is more satisfying than a good venipuncture. After lunch, I just had one more patient to see. "Linda, your 1 o'clock is here." "Thanks, Anna. Can you tell him I'll be there in a minute?" I chewed the last bite of my steak and cheese slowly, taking my time. Swallowed, but it was dry. The thick meat and cheese stuck in my throat. I tried to inhale and the breath stuck in my chest. I pounded on my chest, eyes watering. I could feel the hard lump deep in my throat. It felt like a glowing ember. hot, burning me, seeming to grow larger and larger as the seconds drew out. I hacked, coughed, tried to dislodge the rock, but it didn't budge. I stumbled up from my chair, vision wavering, and threw myself forward onto my chair back. Over and over I flung myself, desperately trying to open my airway as my eyes tunneled, black and red closing in. Finally, with a pop and a sucking sound, the deadly chunk of sandwich flew out of my mouth and smacked wetly onto my computer screen. I stood, dazed, watching the meat and cheese missile slide down my emails, leaving a greener streak in its wake. Just another goddamn day. I went to meet Mr. Alice. He was sitting in the waiting room, a grayish mass, in one of our spindly navy chairs. I'd been informed many times how uncomfortable they were, and how unacceptable that was. Mr. Alice was a sallow-looking older man of medium build. His hair was cropped close, and he made no attempt to hide his receding hairline or palm-sized bald spot on his crown. His skin sagged, and he carried himself with a permanent hunch. In a worn-looking gray polo shirt that had clearly started its life cycle off black, and a pair of sagging khaki slacks. He crossed his ankles, and without looking at me managed to convey an impression of deep displeasure. "Winston Alice, we're ready for you," I said, standing in the doorway to the office. He slowly looked up with a delay, and I was struck with the image of a turtle incrementally, peeking its head out from its shell. "I've been waiting." His voice cracked, gravel from disuse. I knew he lived alone and didn't do much other than visit us. "I'm sorry to hear that. We weren't expecting you for another 25 minutes. My voice came out equally hoarse. I was finding it difficult to stand upright. I wobbled as I held the door open, leaning on it for support. "Come on back." With a grunt, Mr. Alice heaved himself up, leaning on an intricately patterned wooden cane. He walked towards me, each step accompanied by a loud, sticky sound as the cane met our worn linoleum. He shouldered past me without acknowledgement. In the room, I breathed heavily as the blood pressure cuff inflated. "How have you been feeling lately?" "Horrible. I can't sleep. I'm up all night. Nobody will give me anything to help. I have a constant headache. My kids never call me, and you all sure don't do a damn thing for me." I felt for Mr. Alice. He didn't have it easy, but it wasn't easy to spend time with him either. My hands shook as I pulled together the supplies I needed for the blood draw. And things have been even worse lately. I've been feeling like something is crawling under my skin, slithering through my fucking veins. I haven't been right, Linda. I'm telling you. I scratch and nothing makes it go away. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I know that itching is a common side effect of your medication. Have you tried using lotion like we discussed last time? I was finding it difficult to collect my thoughts, to formulate sentences. Lotion? He laughed without humor. Lotion wouldn't do a damn thing for me. It's like you people don't even listen. I tried to breathe in and out slowly. Lately I've been working on not taking things personally. It's a daily battle. Easing myself down onto the rolling stool, I gathered my supplies up on a pad and wheeled over to the chair. Opening the packages, arranging things, I took a look at Mr. Alice's skin for the first time, and recoiled. Lumps and pustules covered his pale arms, some dried and smooth, some oozing with fluid. Dried blood-covered streaks ran up and down, crisscrossing and doubling over one another. Shadows of blue and green seemed to lurk in the depths of his skin. Nausea bubbled up within me, and I smelled a fetid, stale odor rising from the pustules. I swallowed, feeling a sharp pain in my chest as I did so. I summoned my fading professionalism and tried to act as if I saw this kind of thing every day. How long have you had this rash, Mr. Alice? I see you have been scratching a lot. Try using a cold pack on the area rather than itching. Are you stupid? Look at me. You think ice is going to help? I feel like tearing off my skin. I fantasize about peeling it off slowly, in long, delicious strips. That's all I think about. How it would feel to erase these spots and get rid of what I can feel each and every minute underneath. I would be reborn. I readied my tourniquet. Pulling the rubber tight, I gathered my courage. Drawing closer, I gingerly wrapped it around his arm, pulling as I tied it tightly. Mr. Alice let out a thin shriek. The pustules at the sight of the tourniquet stretched and began to burst, oozing greenish and white fluid. They released a stink of death and decay as they split apart. I turned my head away and tried to contain my retch as I felt bile press against the back of my throat. I breathed in through my mouth and looked at the mangled arm. Grabbing a gauze square, I did my best to wipe off the pus and blood. Mr. Alice was whimpering now, seeming somehow less human than before. Just get it over with, Linda. For God's sake, you're supposed to be a professional. Don't you do this all day long? What are you waiting for? Deep breath in. I felt the crook of his arm for the antecubital vein. Luckily, it was nice and plump, in a spot that was smooth and free of pimples. I felt it, thick and strong beneath the surface. It almost felt lumpy at first, like I could feel a valve. But when I went back for a second try, it was smooth and regular. I composed myself and wiped the site with alcohol. At least it was clean. I readied my butterfly needle and plunged it into the vein. At first I thought I had missed. I pulled back a little and adjusted. No blood filled the needle. Slowly easing the needle further into Mr. Alice's arm, I began to observe a slow trickle of dark fluid. It seeped down the needle, down the tube, through my vacutainer and into the tube. Thick and vicious. It was darker than any blood I had ever seen. Almost black. And as it filled the tube, I looked closer. It wasn't uniform. I peered into the vial and thought for a moment I might be seeing things. Legs. Eyes. Tiny but visible. Crawling and swarming into the tube. Centipedes were flooding my vial. Faster and faster they entered, soon filling the tube and, to my horror, spilling out over the lip. I whipped off the tourniquet. No use. The flow of insects continued, seemingly quicker than ever before. I pulled out the needle, pressing a gauze pad at the entry site, but I could feel a force against my fingers pushing against me. The pad grew wet with fluid, and behind it, oozing out the sides, the centipedes came forth. With horror, I glanced at Mr. Alice's face. It was empty, his eyes glaring out at nothing. No sound came from his mouth now. He was silent, but the centipedes moved as a mass, emitting hissing and clicking sounds. I backed away. A huge black sea of insects erupted. Not just from the needle stuck on Mr. Alice's arm, but from the corners of his eyes, from his nose, from his gaping mouth. From beneath his clothes, streams of centipedes crept. The flower print of the chair was no longer visible. The centipedes had claimed it. A pool of them began to overtake the floor. That was my limit. I fled. Sprinting out of the room, I slammed the door behind me. The crack underneath was wide enough for me to see that the centipedes wouldn't be contained for long. I grabbed my purse from the drawer, power walked towards reception, and told Anna I wasn't feeling well and I would be leaving early today. My breathing halting, I left and didn't look back. I think some PTO is in my immediate future. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You may refer to me as the tour guide, or guide for short. I am here to spread awareness for our newly opened Nightmare Museum. The curator has employed many hunters to go out and search for all different manner of nightmare to house here on display at our museum. And now he is ready to share with you, the public, its contents. The first item I will talk to you all about today is the Nightmare Museum itself. There are many rules to this place, and should you find yourself as a guest, it would do well for you to know them. The first rule I should mention is that we open sharply at 3:33 a.m. every Saturday morning. It matters not what country you're from, nor what language you speak. Anyone can be a guest at the Nightmare Museum. The way that you will know that you have been chosen as a guest is a door nearby will open, and no matter how lit the area may be, or what the room was before it opened as the entrance, you will not be able to see beyond the threshold of said door. Choosing to enter is purely up to you. The next rule I will discuss is time. See, the museum is both everywhere and nowhere, both eternal and ephemeral. That being said, time does not behave the same in the museum as on Earth. While walking the floor room of the museum, time will be stopped. Time can not be stopped. However, all throughout the museum, the exhibits are best seen when, how shall I say, active. Therefore, the exhibit habitats will be immune to the time freeze. Should you find yourself accidentally inside of an exhibit, do not attempt to return or exit the habitat from whence you came. If it was that easy to escape the habitat, all chaos would be breaking loose all over the museum. Honestly, your best bet at freedom would be simply to interact with the exhibit and give a show to the rest of the attendees not so foolish as to get themselves caught up in one of our exhibits. The last rule is do not stray from the group as the tour moves along. The rule is more so for your own protection. I do not care if you meet an untimely end, and navigating the museum can be perilous. After spending the designated time at each exhibit, I shall be moving on, so keep up. Now that you are aware of our rules, I shall tell you the classifications of each of the exhibits. Each exhibit is classified by the potential for death while interacting with said exhibit. Each of these different levels will be color coordinated. The lowest level, and dark blue, is uncertain. The next, and colored yellow, is impossible. The third level, associated with orange, is likely. Finally, and not least, we have the level associated with red, which is certain. The way these colors can be shown may come about in multiple ways. The color associated with its level may be outlined on the floor or around an entryway to the exhibit. This is indicative that if standing on the other side of said line, that is the risk you stand of dying. Interaction with the exhibits is purely voluntary, and you will not be stopped if even the exhibit is a red class exhibit. You as a guest of the museum are fully entitled to interact or behave however you want in the exhibit. You will not be stopped. That is all there is to tell you about the Nightmare Museum, so stay tuned and be prepared to hear more from me, your humble tour guide, about the many exhibits we house here with us. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. It was too late to walk Skipper. The sun had gone down and the wind had started to rustle the leaves and trees that surround Hollow Drive. Peter wouldn't be coming home until 9, and I had a long list of to-dos before work the next morning. "Hey Skip, come here boy," I called out. I took his long red leash that hung from one of our key holder hooks and attached the little leash hook to his harness. I decided to simply go out and tie his leash to one of the rusty metal pipes that protruded out from our front yard. His leash was long enough to where Skipper could walk all along the front yard and do his business, and also long enough to come and scratch on the door once he was finished. As I opened my door to take him out, the sharp November wind hit my face and I instantly felt the stinging sensation built up in my nose. I exhaled a quick breath into my cusped hands, so as to warm both my hands and face by the warmth of my breath that projected back at me from the little cave my hands made. I quickly tied Skipper's leash to the pipe as I looked around to see if any of my neighbors were out and about. The street was deserted of people. I guess the cold had made everyone cozy up and stay in. "I'll be right back, Skippy. Be a good boy and scratch the door for me when you're done, yeah?" I did a slight jog back around the corner and up the stony pathway back to the house. I headed back into the kitchen to wash my hands and put the dishes away. Before starting on the laundry, I switch on the TV to have some background noise. The house gets too stuffy when doing laundry, so I open my sliding glass door in the kitchen that is connected to my backyard, leaving only the light, meshed, sliding screen door closed. I'm sorting out the colored clothes from the whites and towels, when the show playing is suddenly interrupted by a breaking local news story. Breaking news here at PVLN. Family of 3 is found dead in what seems to be a late-night robbery gone wrong on Magnolia Avenue. Suspects are unknown. Please be careful and lock your doors and windows. It is the holiday season and many criminals are taking advantage of this. More on this story tonight on our midnight broadcast. Jesus Christ. Magnolia Avenue was maybe 2 streets away from Hollow Drive. A cold chill ran down my spine. I shuddered at the thought of the possibility that could have easily been Peter, Skip, and myself. I quickly decided that it's best if I bring Skip inside so I can lock up and wait for Peter to get home in about an hour and a half. I reached for my sweater on my kitchen table. When I heard Skipper's little scratches on the door, I was relieved that he had gotten enough time outside to do what he needed. I briskly walked out the kitchen and into the living room towards the front door. I suddenly got a weird feeling in my chest. My adrenaline was slowly starting to rise. My hand got cold and clammy as I put on the doorknob. Check the peephole, I thought to myself. I sucked in my breath and held it as I slowly raised myself to the tips of my feet and put my right eye slowly in front of the peephole. No one. I let out my breath and chuckled to myself. I was merely psyching myself out from the stupid, morbid news story from earlier. I opened my door. There was no sign of Skipper on my front door. I called out to him and still no movement, except for the wind that had seemingly picked up, even stronger than before. I called out Skipper's name a second time. Still nothing. I shut my door as I grabbed my phone off the coffee table to my right to call my neighbor. Skipper has a habit of pulling on the leash so hard that he manages to pry free from his collar and run into my neighbor's yard to fight his cat. I completely freeze and I hear the slow, faint scraping. Shh. Sound of my sliding door opening in the kitchen. My hands tremble as I quickly dial my neighbor's number. Call failed. My illuminated phone screen stares at me and I stare back at it. I stand there, unsure of what to do next. I look at the top right corner of the phone screen and my heart sinks at the sight of the words, "No service." The wind must have disrupted the signal from the nearest service tower. I hear a familiar jingle coming from the kitchen. Skipper suddenly peers out from around the corner of the wall that blocks my view from the living room into the kitchen. I sigh a huge breath of relief as I bend down to pet him. I notice he's still wearing his collar. His leash hasn't been undone. It's been cut. I hear scratching coming from the door again. This time, I was fully aware it couldn't be my dog. Carefully and cautiously, I take light steps toward the front door and peer out the peephole again. I see a man crouching, eyes wide, maliciously grinning and licking his lips as he stares intently at the door handle. My heart sinks as I slowly peer down to my doorknob and realize I had not locked it yet. Click. I locked the door as quietly as I possibly could. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The man scratched my door harder than the last time. My heart was nearly jumping out of my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I peered out the peephole again to try and get a better look at the man. He was ever so tall, head bowed down looking at my door handle. I shakingly take my phone out of my pocket and try to dial 911. No service still. Battery is at 2%. I peer out the peephole again to keep this stranger in my sight. I see the man fumbling with his pockets, as if he's looking for something. I switch to the camera app on my phone and raise it to the peephole, in an attempt to take a picture of the man. My camera was only able to take pictures of the peephole, not the images behind the peephole's glass. I raise myself again to peer through the hole. The man is frozen. He slowly raises his head and stares directly back at me, grinning, eyes wide, not blinking. Without moving his head or eyes away, He slowly takes something out of his pocket. A small, folded piece of paper. He unfolds the piece of paper, still staring at the peephole, knowing that the only thing separating us was a wooden door. I stare back in horror as he slowly raises the note for me to read through the hole. Kitchen door. I got my PhD from the Stockholm Royal Institute of Technology and finished my postdoctoral work at the University of Bern in Switzerland in 2015. I won't go into detail, but my work centered around electromagnetic distribution and practical electromedical application. Chances are that if you check Google Scholar for these keywords, my name will pop up as a co-author on at least one of the top 5 results. However, in early December of 2016, I was in an accident. I was staying overnight for a conference in Copenhagen, where a colleague of mine had rented a large apartment. However, due to an electrical error, there was heat buildup in the main water heater, causing a steam explosion. I was sleeping pretty much wall to wall with it. My face and shoulders took the main brunt of the boiling water, steam, and pressure. The last thing I remember seeing was a bright light, followed by a sudden and complete dark. I had to go through evisceration and enucleation of both eyes. I lost 8 teeth on the right side of my face and most of my nose. At least 20% of my body fat in my right arm was burned off. The reconstructive surgery of my face took a team of surgeons 18 hours. This was followed by months of just trying to survive, moving back in with my family, and going through cosmetic surgery, mainly for my face. To this day, I still have no idea what was said at the conference. After a few months, I was fitted for double eye prosthetics. It took a total of 3 months before I was even given the option to start therapy. I'm not gonna lie, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Most people who are legally blind can still perceive some kind of light, but complete blindness? About 7% of us is one step further. One day I could be suicidal, and the next I was determined to learn Braille. Because of the damage to my eyelids, the surgeons opted to connect new tear ducts to my nose, so crying just made my nose runny. 3 years later, I was in a much better state of mind. Although sudden blindness isn't something you ever really adapt to, I was doing better. I still wasn't ready to go out on my own, but with a friend or family member just to help me along, I could go pretty far. I also learned to appreciate all those weird accessibility options that come with most computers. You have no idea. In autumn of 2019, I was contacted by a man who told me he represented a group associated with renewable energy research. Living in Sweden, renewable energy is a big deal, and it is something I've personally been interested in. In fact, it was going to be the subject of my next article, just before the accident. The man offered me a job. He told me that he worked at a lab with disabled scientists, and that my expertise was in high demand. The pay was more than generous, and as a benefit package, I would be given a personal assistant. Pay for an off-site 2-bedroom apartment was also a part of the benefits. I agreed to have an interview. The man who was going to interview me was clearly from another country, but he was ready to fly out to meet me at short notice. He came to visit the very next day. We had a private conversation at my parents' house. He asked a lot of questions about my work, and I could hear him tapping away at a touchscreen. We discussed some of the details, but there was one thing he consciously seemed to avoid: where the main lab was located. He seemed uncomfortable talking about it, but he promised that I would be given a private flight wherever I wanted during downtime off-site. There would be 4 weeks of work on-site, living in the apartment outside the main lab, followed by 2 weeks off-site, kind of like paid vacation. I would be in rotating shifts with one morning, midday, evening, and night shift. The weirdest thing was revealed just as I was about to accept the offer. Every single scientist at the main lab was completely blind. I accepted the offer. The next week, I was picked up by the same man, let's call him Samuel, and taken to a private flight. I still had no idea where we were going, but other passengers were speaking in an Asian language. Indonesian, I think. On the flight, I was introduced to my personal assistant, Mila. I think she was Australian. Mila was a darling. She knew exactly what to say and when to help me, but most importantly, she knew when to give me space. It was as if she could read discomfort on my, albeit reconstructed face, and just acted on it immediately. She must have had a lot of experience working with the visually impaired. My first days were mostly orientation and introductions. I would be working with a team of 2 other scientists and 7 assistants. 2 each, 1 general. Apparently, our personal assistants would not be available while in the lab, but they would be on call as soon as we went off-site. They would also help us with cooking, cleaning, whatever we wanted. It was a big operation, a total of 40 people just in the main building, all completely blind, at least 100 others. With the pay we were getting and the benefits, this was a very expensive project. We're talking millions, possibly tens of millions. My team would be working with material research. As Samuel explained, they were developing a new type of material as part of renewable energy tech. They weren't completely clear on the possible end result, but the metal we would be testing was told to be unique, extremely valuable, and uncomfortably bright. Apparently, it could cause blindness during prolonged exposure, which was the main reason they'd put together a team of blind scientists. During my first day at the facility, I was given plenty of time to adapt. The other members of my team were just as new as I was, but we were given radio instructions how to move through the various corridors. There was a decontamination room, without protective suits, and we were told to follow guiding pipes along the walls. On the left were cold pipes, on the right were warm. 3 pipes on each side, leading to a total of 6 rooms. The pipes had square, circle, and triangle engravings, making it easier for us to find our main room. We were team warm triangle. The work itself wasn't that bad, mostly just repetitive. The test object was isolated in a separate room, but we could check it through samples, material exposures, and readings. We were all given separate workstations and hearing equipment so we could isolate the sounds of our specific assistants, and just to make sure our computer equipment wouldn't read over one another. We had buttons on our headsets to adjust who we could listen to, and to mute certain sounds. It took a lot of time to adapt to it. There were at least 50 codes to memorize. I got to know my assistants fairly well. There was Aaron, an American, and Holger, a Norwegian. They were both older than me, and both had master's degrees. They were quick to follow directions and equally quick to offer suggestions. I could tell they were having some authority issues, but they didn't make it a problem, and the first 3-week-long shifts were fine. We went from midday to evening to night. The night shift was, of course, the toughest. By now, I was getting to know the place and routine. I had noticed a few things during my testing, but also just from the context of what was being talked about in the facility. The 7th assistant would come down with lunches for us, and we ate in a small common room, warm circle, where we would talk more freely about what we'd learned. We never changed from warm triangle as our main room, even when we changed shifts. The whole setup was weird. The material was extremely reflective. From the way it was tested, it seemed rectangular in shape, and thin. My colleagues talked about it possibly being similar to a pane of glass. The material had several strange properties. It would absorb light but dissipated it almost instantly. It would, to some degree, also absorb electric energy, low-level radiation, and radio waves. I'd never seen anything like it, if you pardon the expression. By chance, we also discovered a peculiar feature. The object, by now called the pane, briefly absorbed sound waves and would reflect it back after a few seconds, like a delayed echo but slightly distorted, kind of like it had been run through an underwater filter, bouncing between sheets of metal. If I said, "Hello?" I would hear a clear, but lower, "Hello," right back after about 8 seconds. This being despite me standing no less than 10 feet away from the object. It made no sense. Once, during the night shift, Holger fell ill. It wasn't bad, just a light case of pneumonia, but the company had a zero-tolerance policy for sickness in the workplace. He got the week off at his apartment, and I had to work with one less assistant. It delayed my progress somewhat, but Aaron was eager to make up for lost time. Too eager, it turns out. On the second to last day of the night shift, Aaron accidentally caused a power outage. We were pressure testing the object when Aaron slipped and knocked over some volatile materials at another workstation. Nothing happened, explosion-wise, but the entire room went into immediate lockdown and the power was shut off. The doors shut and locked from the outside. I didn't notice the lights go out, but I could feel the room quickly growing cold. It occurred to me that the object was probably absorbing the warmth, and there was no climate control to compensate anymore. Then something weird happened. We were all sitting quietly, our headsets being turned off, and waited for the power to come back on. That's when I heard something. "Hello?" It was the same off-putting, distorted voice that I had thought was a delayed echo. One of my colleagues, Gertrude, responded with a hello right back. I heard 4 quick footsteps like the start of a drum roll, and something slammed into the glass separating us from the object. Something squishy. "Hello?" Now we stayed quiet. The footsteps came in quick bursts, pacing back and forth, looking for weaknesses in the glass. We usually use small airlocks to put in samples to test. We had 2 airlocks, and the leftmost one of these was attacked. I could hear something rattling the airlock, trying to rip it loose. "Hello?" I could hear the grinding sound of metal being bent. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. The power came back with a vengeance. My headphones were full of people screaming. "Evacuation protocol initiated. Proceed to... Get out! Get the fuck out! Warm triangle. Respond immediately. I repeat." Half the voices were in a foreign language. We ran for the door. I didn't need to follow the pipes to get back to the decontamination room, but only then did I notice we were 1 person short. We'd lost Gertrude. Once outside, we were separated and isolated, standing outside in freezing temperatures. I was stripped naked. Several people, all screaming in a foreign language, lifted my arms and legs and checked me from my feet all the way to my hair. I was forced into a plastic tent where they shaved my head, forced my mouth open, and checked my teeth. My ears were cleaned with some sort of antiseptic, and my eye prosthetics were discarded completely. It was quick, violent, and terrifying. I was locked inside my apartment the rest of the night. Mila came around to help me, but she told me she was instructed not to talk about my work under any circumstances. That's when I first suspected that my apartment was bugged. I spent a week in that apartment with daily checkups. I felt fine, but the entire ordeal was stressing me out. Having my head shaved was uncomfortable, and I was scared they might find something they wouldn't like. After that 1 week, I was suddenly told that it was necessary to terminate my position. I didn't recognize the voice of the man telling me this. I was given 4 months of full pay, an apology, a non-disclosure agreement, and an immediate flight back home. Mila was holding back tears, trying to help me. She seemed frightened. I've been home ever since, but I come to you to share my story. I've been doing my best to stay financially independent, but life hasn't been treating me well. I'm still having stress reactions, and there has been a recent development that I don't know how to deal with. Last night I was brushing my teeth. Power went out. I could hear the air conditioning and dryer suddenly go quiet, and the entire room felt colder, except for the bathroom mirror, which radiated a slight heat. I stretched my hand out to touch it. This might be hard to understand for someone who doesn't think about their sense of touch too often, but I've touched that mirror every night for years on end by now. I know exactly where my hand was in the space of the room, and there was no mirror where my hand was. Still, I touched it. Every part of my finger touched something extruding from the mirror's surface. Something with rounded edges. Then it made a sound. Hello? I was an only child up to the age of 6, and truth be told, I don't remember much of the time I spent being the only recipient of attention from my family. I remember that my parents liked to dote on me, almost to an excruciating degree, and my grandparents did no less of the sort. If anything, they did it even more, providing me with more sugary treats, toys, and gifts any kid could only dream to get. It was entertaining in the beginning. Soon enough, however, I realized that it would be fun to have a sibling, someone to share the glory of being the son or daughter of this family. I didn't know it at the time, but my parents had trouble conceiving children. Having me was a risk and a hassle enough as it was, so having another one seemed unlikely. Yet it seemed that my prayers were answered because not long after I turned 6, my mother announced that there would be another baby in the family. There was a grand celebration and every family member in the vicinity, my aunt and uncle with my cousin Benedict, my grandparents, some other relatives I didn't know about, attended the gathering and gave their congratulations to my parents. There was cake and balloons and gifts to help prepare for the upcoming arrival of my sibling. I was ecstatic as well, and I could see the tears in my mother's eyes as everything unfolded around him. At first, I expected them to be tears of pure joy. She was a very emotional person. However, the longer I looked at her, as she tried to dry the tears away, my 6-year-old mind could already deduce that it wasn't a look of joy. It was pain that filled her gaze. The months went by in the blink of an eye, and while my father and I were counting down the days before my sibling finally arrived, my mother seemed to grow gaunter and wearier with each day that went by. I thought she would be happy with having another child. My father and I certainly were, but why did her happiness seem to wither? I wasn't the only one who seemed to notice this. My father did, and I hid behind the door when he confronted her about this. He even went as far as to suggest therapy to what he referred to as postpartum depression, which I didn't know what that was at the time. And my mother lashed out at him and a huge fight erupted between them. "Why are you against this, Liz? This is what we both wanted." My father yelled at her. "I didn't want this. You did." My mother snapped back. "I never agreed to this." "I thought we were going to be happy. We were trying for so long and all we got was Ellie." "Ellie was enough, James. She was always enough. For you, for the both of us." I went to my room after that, not wanting to hear anything else as I hid under my covers, trying to muffle the sounds of their argument with my head shoved under the pillow. I hoped that this would be the only time that I ever heard them argue so vehemently. Ordinarily, they were loving and affectionate towards one another, but after that, things only escalated from there. My mother became more depressed and refused to eat as much as she normally would. My father became more violent. Not physically, but he would yell and berate me for everything and nothing at the same time. My mother wasn't excluded from this sort of treatment, and if anything, she received the worst of it. My father was only 1 inch from hitting her at one point, and he most likely would have had I not stepped in and intervened. I didn't like this change in our family dynamic. I just wanted it all to go back to how it always was. I didn't resent my unborn sibling for what happened because I knew the fault did not lie with them. There was something else that had changed, but it was completely my 6-year-old brain could not quite comprehend. Sometime later, when my mother was 6 months along, she was sleeping on the living room couch and I was watching her. That's when I noticed that her stomach seemed to move. The baby was kicking and I had never seen it do that before. It didn't wake my mother up, so after carefully making my way to the couch, I sat down next to her and watched the activity in my mother's belly as close as I could without disturbing her peace. "I can't wait until you're out," I whispered, followed by a small giggle. "We can ride bikes and hide and seek and tag, and we can play house with my dolls. But I don't know if you're a boy or a girl yet, so we'll have to wait and see if you even like dolls." Then, as if out of nowhere, a voice spoke back to me. "I wouldn't mind playing dolls with you." It was a child's voice, a boy, but it didn't sound right. There was something else crawling under his tone, something I couldn't put a name on. I don't know what it was, and when I looked around the room for anyone else, I found none. I turned back to the belly. "Can you talk?" "I can. I didn't learn to talk until I was 3. Can babies talk before they are out?" "No, but I can." "How's that?" "I don't know, but I don't like it in here." He continued, muffled by the barriers of my mother's womb. "I want to get out." "I think you will soon," I replied, trying to brighten his mood a little. "I'm sure Mommy and Daddy will be happy as soon as you're here, with us." Then he said something that made my childish fantasy come to an end. "They won't be." "Why's that?" He didn't speak after that, and when I tried to ask and pry him for more information, I woke up my mother, who chastised me for waking her up and sent me to my room so she could get some more rest. My father came home shortly after that, and I could hear them argue from the comfort of my room. Sometime after that, I spoke to my unborn brother again after my mother had laid down to take her routine nap. "So, you're going to become my brother?" "Yes. I decided that the male gender would provide me more opportunities." "Can babies decide if they want to become a boy or a girl?" "No, but I can." "How's that?" "You're a very curious child." "My grandma says so too." "It's very tenacious." "What's that mean? It's a big word." "Never mind." He said, "You protected us, and for that, I owe you a debt." "What's a debt?" He was quiet for a couple of seconds before he spoke again. "Once I'm out of this flesh prison I've been confined in, we can talk like normal people." "But I like how we're talking now. It's just fine," I argued, not seeing the flaw in my logic. "You didn't believe I'd stay in here forever, did you?" "No, but will you still talk when you're out of Mommy's belly?" "It will take me some time to adjust, but I'll talk eventually." "So I'll have to wait before we can talk again?" "Naturally," he said flatly. "So how come you're able to talk now before you're even out? That doesn't make any sense." "Few things make sense, child. Least of all me." "You don't make any sense. How so?" "Because I'm not like you." "Of course not. You're a boy," I exclaimed, reclining when I noticed my mother stirring in her sleep. I didn't want to wake her up because that meant that my conversation with my sibling would have to continue on another note. "That's not what I implied," he said, evidently growing tired by my lack of understanding. "I'm not like you." I blinked in confusion. "But Mommy and Daddy made you, so you have to be." "Your mother did not procreate me with your father. He is a barren one." "Ah, you have to stop with so many big words. I shouted frustrated, which ultimately woke my mother up. Thus, our conversation was ended. I didn't have another talk with him up until he was born. I remember being at the hospital after my mother had given birth, with my baby brother locked inside some kind of glass box. He was cute, and I stared at him with a smile on my face as I watched my baby brother sleep peacefully there. My mother, on the other hand, was far from peaceful. I overheard the nurses saying that she refused to look at the infant, much less hold him after he was born. She was in hysterics, crying and yelling at my father as we visited after the delivery. The doctors had to sedate her in an effort to keep her from moving from the bed, as she was already in a fragile state as it was. Before we returned home a couple of days later, I was allowed to hold the baby. He was heavy, but that was given since I was just 6 years old. He was so quiet and didn't talk at all, and I didn't really mind it. I was fine with just looking at him. "When are you going to talk?" I asked as I cradled him in my arms. "When can we talk again? I miss talking to you." He didn't answer, but his eyes were on me for the entire time. He had such silvery, bright eyes. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I later learned what was so strange about it. My eyes were blue, my mother's eyes were green, and my father's eyes were brown. I initially thought that after the baby was born, things would go back to normal in our family. My mother and father would become the loving parents that they always were, and we could play together and have fun like we used to. No, things became much, much worse from there. My mother never recovered from the birth, and she and my father would get into these constant fights that ended with broken furniture and shattered glass on the floor. By then, I was used to the fights, but not exactly these kinds of fights. Whenever they argued, I would just hold my brother in my arms and sing him a lullaby, trying to muffle out the sound of the commotion outside our room. I hoped he would talk to me again, but he never did. Then one night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of cries coming from my brother's room, and I quickly got up and went to investigate. And what I saw there would forever traumatize me. Blood. There was so much blood. My father laid in a pool of it, a gaping wound in his neck that could only have been created by a sharp but askew object. He was twisting slightly where he laid, but even I, a child just barely past first grade, knew that it was too late to do anything about it. I turned to my brother's cradle, where I saw my mother standing with her back to me, a bloodied piece of glass in her hand. She didn't seem to notice me, or she simply didn't care. My brother cried and screamed in the cradle, and I was about to jump and grab him when I saw my mother slowly raise the blood-stained shard in her hand above my brother's head. I lunged at her faster than lightning and wrapped my arms around my mother's waist, pulling her back with all my might. I was hardly a strong child, but the knowledge that my brother's life was in danger was enough to motivate my muscles to make some effort, and I succeeded. I managed to pull my mother back from the cradle by a few steps, but it wasn't much in the long run. Still, it was enough to hinder her for a short time. My mother fell to the floor on her back, dropping the shard and sending it away into the furthest corner of the room. Without a moment to lose, I picked my brother up from the cradle and made a beeline for the door, but fell to the floor as my mother grabbed my ankle. I softened the fall, and while my brother continued to wail, he was otherwise uninjured. I didn't get very far inspecting him for further damage when my mother slowly crawled over me, her bloodied hands searching frantically for the baby. Her eyes were wide and deranged. She was a woman I no longer remembered as the sweet and nurturing mother I had what felt like so long ago. "Give it to me," she shouted, trying desperately to reach the baby I held out of her reach. "Give it to me, Ellie. Leave us alone," I yelled back, tears streaming down my eyes as my mind processed what a child should not have to understand. "Don't hurt my brother. It's an abomination." She snarled so saliva spilled out of her mouth. "It wasn't supposed to be born. It doesn't belong in this world, now give it to me." But I wouldn't let her have him. In one final effort to get free, I kicked her as hard as I could into her stomach. It sent her falling back and off of us. And so I crawled back to my feet with the baby still in my arms and ran out of the house, screaming for help from anyone who would hear me. The neighbors heard my cries and let me inside. They called the police and CPS and investigated the house. I didn't know what happened, as all I cared about was having my brother safe in my arms, safe from the world that wished to harm him. I later learned that they found my mother in the house, hanging from a noose fashioned from a curtain in my brother's bedroom. After that, we were sent to live with our grandparents, and all was as well as it could have been, considering. I had from then on learned to grow up and care for myself and my brother. While our grandparents were there to support us through everything, I felt like I had a responsibility as my brother's older sister to step up to the plate, so I learned to cook, clean, and take care of him. I learned it all before I was 16, and he was 10 years old. He could talk well by then, exceeding the vocabulary of a boy his age. He was gifted too, and knew much that no one had ever heard of. I was proud of him, and for a time, I forgot about the conversations we had before he was even born. One day, however, I came across a letter hidden in my grandparents' study, addressed to me by my mom. The memories came back to me, and not even hours with a therapist could ever hope to erase them completely from my brain. Judging by the fact that there were blood stains on it, I assumed that my mother had written it the very same day she tried to kill us. My grandparents must have found it and kept it hidden from me all these years, and I don't blame them. Still, I read the letter. "Dear Ellie, I am sorry for what I've done to you, but I need you to understand something. I love you. I always have. Your father and I tried for so long to have children, but I later learned that he could never hope to father a child. It was something I kept hidden from him all this time. He was a good man. I need you to remember that. Remember the father you grew up with, and don't fault him for what happened. I did some things I'm not proud of, and I let him believe that he was your biological father. It was selfish of me, but I tried to maintain the hope that he would love you as his own. And he did. We both loved you, and we always will. But your brother, the thing you claim is your brother, it is not like us. It is different, and I don't know the whereabouts of its creator. That thing was not made for this world. It does not belong here. It is a mistake, an abomination. For a time, I tried to go along with it, but the whispers, God, the whispers would never stop. It could talk, and the things it would say were horrible. I know you love it, and I have given you no reason to believe me, but you must kill it. I woke up with your father's blood on my hands because of it. Please, for the love of God, kill it. Your mother." By the end of the letter, my hands were trembling. "Ellie?" I snapped around and looked at my brother standing there in the doorway, his face innocent of any fault. I didn't believe a single ounce of the letter. Not at first, but when I saw my brother standing there with a dead bird in his hand, I had my doubts. "What are you?" I finally asked, after years of not receiving my answer. My brother merely shrugged. "I'm just not like you," he said. My name is Hannah, and I'm a patient at Brentworth Hospital, and something horrible is happening. That morning I was laying in my bed when I heard a loud ruckus out in the hall. I was still in my pajamas as I gingerly lowered myself into my wheelchair. I rolled myself out into the hall only to see two men pushing a stretcher out of my neighbor Jen's room. On top of the stretcher lay a body bag. I gasped, causing one of the nurses to notice me. She cleared her throat nervously before doing her best to compose herself. "All patients to your rooms," she ordered, and I complied. I wheeled back and quickly shut the door, feeling a bit like a child being scolded for stealing candy. I was shocked. I had just had dinner with Jen last night. She had seemed fine, or as fine as any of us are. "Hannah?" The raspy voice of Beth, my roommate, called out. She was about my age, in her mid-30s, with scraggly hair and sallow skin. She wheezed as she spoke, tank of oxygen dutifully by her side. She looked wild as she continued. "Hannah, we need to talk." She too was in a wheelchair. She rolled up to me. "I saw something horrible." She coughed uncontrollably before continuing. "Jen didn't die of natural causes. One of the nurses killed her." I let out a gasp. I was shocked at her claim. It seemed outlandish, but Beth had no reason to lie to me. We had grown close in our time together. "What? How?" I said breathlessly. "I saw one of the nurses smother Jen with a pillow last night," she said, nervously looking over her shoulder as if someone, or maybe the culprit, might pounce out one of the corners in the tiny room. "Why? Why would they do that?" I asked. "I have a theory," Beth said. "I couldn't sleep all night, but was too afraid to wake you, so I just pretended to be sleeping. I spent hours looking for a motive, and I think I found one. You know how the staff keeps complaining that the ward doesn't have enough rooms?" She waited for my nod. "I think they made room." I cringed away from her, but she grabbed my arm. "Think about it. Without new patients, the hospital goes under. If you think about it, Jen was the perfect person to kill. She doesn't have a relationship with any of her siblings, and she was very vocal about it. No one to mourn her. Nobody to ask questions. And God knows she's a difficult woman. A miserable soul." I was doubtful, but Beth strengthened the argument. "I bet you that within a fortnight, that room is filled. Just you watch." And she was right. An old woman named Bessie took up the room. What was even more odd, the staff showed no signs of sadness. Well, except for once. A newer nurse was showing signs of distress. She didn't notice me. Neither did the other nurse as she swept down on her. "Keep up pretenses," she hissed. "If your mask is going to slip, then walk off the ward. You knew what you were getting into." That was when the first nurse noticed me. She gave the other nurse a nudge, and they both faced me with big smiles on their faces. Big, fake smiles on their faces. They tried to make pleasantries with me, and I pretended as if nothing was wrong, but my trust for the nursing staff was gone. One night, Beth had gone ashen. I overheard some of the nurses. "God, it's horrible, Hannah. They're planning to kill again." My blood turned to ice as she said this, but she didn't stop there. They said they were going to clean out room 47B. I almost passed out. That was our room. "When?" I said urgently. "Tonight," she said tearfully. I didn't waste time. I wheeled to the communal phones and dialed 911, only to get a buzzing sound from the line. "Hannah," I heard a sickly sweet voice call out from behind me. "Now what do you think you're doing? The phone's shut off at 9. I turned in my chair to see one of the nurses staring down at me. I didn't think. I only reacted. I slammed my wheelchair straight into her legs. She crumbled with a cry of pain. I went as fast as I could and made it into my room before slamming the door. I could hear footsteps running in my direction. "Beth," I screamed. "Beth, help me hold the door." I could hear the nurses talking, but what they said surprised me. "Damn it. Beth is back. Get the doctor." Beth and I looked at each other confused. What did they mean she was back? "Hannah?" A male voice called gently through the door. "This is Dr. Perry. Hannah, you are safe. Please open the door." "No," I screamed. Beth heard your little plan. You're going to kill us just like you killed Jen. Hannah? He said. Beth isn't real. She is a hallucination. I looked over at Beth to share a look of disbelief at this comment. At least I tried to. Where Beth had been sitting moments ago was nothing but empty space. Hannah, the doctor continued, you have schizophrenia. It's why you're here. No, I cried. My legs, they don't work. Yeah, you were paralyzed when you drove into a crowded street and hit the side of a building. I felt dizzy. But Jen, you killed her. No, he said. Jen killed herself. She was a manic depressive, remember? And I did. I couldn't stop crying. I let go of the door and orderlies rushed in with a sedative in hand, shooting me up before I could do anything else. I saw the newer nurse trying to hide a look of horror. You're doing better, another nurse told her. Just keep practicing a smile. After all, this is nothing. Just another day at Brentworth Hospital for the criminally insane.